Here's what's coming up in episode 148, Slade Roberson.
There were two things that happened that were really the scariest of all in that house. And I think the best story is, I know something I'd love to ask Christine. I'm interested to know like the context of where you are in this moment in time and why it would be meaningful for you to be talking about this now.
I am a professional clinical counselor, and I know that a lot of times my intuition, well, probably that's more than even half of my job. I am in an area that recently suffered two pretty major community tragedies. And as a counselor, I've had the experience of experiencing other people's trauma.
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
School is in session, y'all. At the time of this recording, I'm in the middle of my third week of school with kids. I know, it's hard to believe. We start earlier than most schools do here in the US. So I've slammed into a normal person schedule again, including having a realistic bedtime, which is difficult for me. Lots of meetings, a new leadership position with some new responsibilities, new faces, cool new kids. I think it's going to be a great year. It's my 18th year of teaching. But do bear with me. I know this episode is a bit late, and I may not be as regular with my episodes for a while until I get caught up, but I'll get there. This kind of leads me to what I'm drinking right now, though. Want to know what it is? Wind Dancer Tea. Wind Dancer Tea from Nuwati Herbals is great for when you need more energy and stamina. It contains yerba mate. I'm making up some of the pronunciation of these, I'm sure. But it's probably fun just listening to me try to butcher it, right? Eleuthero, Gotu Cola, Tribulus, Rhodiola, green tea, and more. It's got this fresh flavor, is the only way I know how to put it, that for me probably doesn't even need any honey. But I do usually put a little honey in all of the teas, though. Stay tuned, because a little later in the show, I'll share more about Nuwati Herbals and how you can get 15% off your order at nuwatiherbals.com. Slade Roberson is a professional intuitive, author, and host of the podcast Shift Your Spirits, where he talks about spirituality with fewer hearts and flowers than most New Age blather. He also mentors emerging intuitives, psychics, and healers in a program called Automatic Intuition. Today, we are sitting down with one of our favorite guests, and that is Slade Roberson. This is actually the third visit. And he joined me with Ash Riley in episode 132 in one of the most random and hilarious episodes ever recorded of any podcast, which we titled Straight Dudes, Get Thyself to a Spirit Triangle. And that title was kind of my attempt at honoring Slade and his great titles, because he has such great titles. He's a genius in that area. And you know that very well if you have been following him since the days of his blog, Shift Your Spirits. But before that deliciously gay episode, We had Slade on for the first time a year ago in episode 125. And in that episode, we really jumped into the inspiration for his popular blog, Shift Your Spirits. And of course, now that has morphed into his podcast, Shift Your Spirits. And it was really great to hear how events in Slade's life from college on brought him to us. So I actually want to play that teaser that I made for the episode last year because I think it's one of the best teasers for one of my podcast episodes. Because if this doesn't make you want to listen to the whole episode to learn more, I don't know what will. So here's that teaser, and then we'll be right back with Slade because I haven't even let him say hi yet.
As the cliche goes, the voices in my head started to tell me about this blog that I was going to start called Shift Your Spirits. And I did. And little did I know, there were a bunch of people who wanted to read that stuff, and they found me.
You have a podcast title called How to F Up Your Ability to Manifest Joy and Abundance. You are a genius, Slade.
But also, I want to celebrate the fact that you're a little bit busted, and so am I. And I'm not trying to be anything except what I can be. And of course, we want to be better than we are. And so, do those titles reflect that? Because to me, that's where I'm coming from when I'm making those jokes.
So, I mean, that was such a good episode. If you haven't heard that episode, please go check out episode 125. You can even go to BigSeance.com/125 to get there. So today I told Slade, I want the prequel. I want the prequel to Shift Your Spirits. I want us to dig back into his childhood to see what made him that cool kid that wanted a nose ring, but only kind of wore a nose ring. Remember that, Slade?
Vaguely.
But then I also asked him if he'd be willing to work with a listener on air, someone who is developing their intuition or psychic abilities, because Slade has a number of courses, and a few of those are automatic intuition and talking to your spirit guides. And I thought that would be fun. And so a little bit later, we'll invite our listener, Christine, onto the show and be a fly on the wall for that. So I should have let you speak officially before now. Welcome back to the Parlor, Slade Roberson.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Always love talking to Slade Roberson because I could give you any topic and I think you could just make it a beautiful gift.
Aw, thank you. That's quite a compliment.
You told me that you could tell a story about growing up in a haunted house. Can you take us there?
Yes. I call it Tales of a Fourth Grade Haunting because I was a big Judy Blume fan at that time. So yeah, I mean, I'd had a couple of experiences even earlier than that, which we can come back to if you want to ask about it. I saw an angel when I was around 5, but when I was 9 or so, and my brother was about 5, our parents moved into kind of a temporary house that we were only going to live in for a short period of time because we were having another house built. And I guess we sold the one we were in. And so we kind of needed to rent something for a little while. And we actually rented a house in our own neighborhood, but it was a really busted house. It was very creepy. All of the design choices in the house were really horrifying. Like they were scary, scattered. Like every single room had a different color carpet. It was a lot. So it wasn't a very happy, pretty environment. It had a sort of darkness and a weirdness and a kind of schizophrenia to it, just based on what it looked like, right? So there were a lot of different experiences that happened in that house that, a couple of them were really up there high on the list of paranormal things that have happened to me in my life, or, unexplained encounters or things that I've heard and seen. I mean, out of a list of top 10, I would say a good 5 of them come from this one period. It was only about a year that we lived there, but there was a variety of things that happened. It started out with just little things like seeing a white cat out of the corner of your eye. Like if you sat in a certain place in the house and looked down this long hallway, you would see this white Persian cat just sort of dart back and forth across from one room to the next. And I would sit there purposefully so that I could see it. And you would. It would always show up. And so it was kind of like a little ghost cat. There was something in the den, of course, the feeling of going downstairs into a scary den or a basement and being chased back out of there by some invisible force, So imagine that feeling like really to the point where you almost can't catch your breath. It's so terrifying. And you would feel that sense even when you went down into that space. Another thing that happened downstairs in that space is something cut me on my leg one time. I thought at the time that I had been bitten by something like a rat. Of course, this was suburbia, and even though it was decorated scary, it wasn't like a dirty house by any means. It just had very, weird kind of colors in it and stuff. But I have a scar on the inside of my leg to this day of where I was like bit by something. And so there were little things like that. There was a creepy crawl space with a skeleton key that had been plastered into the wall, right?
The actual key?
Yeah, it was an actual key, and it was like an old-fashioned key. This wasn't like a Victorian house or something. This was very Brady Bunch era neighborhood, but it had this old-fashioned skeleton key that had been, plastered into the wall, like vinyl spackling covering it up. Like it had been pressed into the sheetrock, right?
Drywall.
Yeah, drywall. So it was like mudded into the drywall in a crawl space. And of course, finding that was like, a million mysteries that unfortunately I don't really know what that key went to and why it was there. It was never solved. But there were 2 things that happened that were really the scariest of all in that house. And I think the best story is I was homesick. My mom had recently gone back to work when my brother went to kindergarten. And I was like in 4th grade when I lived in this house. This was the first place I ever lived where I came home from school on the bus and let myself into the house and, made myself a snack. And I did chores and stuff until my parents got home a few hours later. So it was not unheard of for me to stay home by myself if I was sick for whatever reason. My mother was willing to let me just stay home and sleep and watch TV and stuff. So I was sleeping and kind of woke up from a feverish dream, and I was hearing something being dragged around in the garage underneath my bedroom, which was right over the garage. My dad had these enormous toolboxes, the kind that are like 6 feet long that you pack into the back of a truck bed. And he built houses at the time. And he would take these tools back and forth. He wouldn't leave them in his truck because they were too valuable. So he would actually unload them and reload them. My first thought in my mind was that he was home and they were unloading these big metal tool cases. And that's what it sounded like. It sounded like you can totally imagine the sound of a toolbox being dragged across concrete, like what that sounds like. So I got up and I looked out the window, fully expecting to see his truck sitting down there in the driveway. And it wasn't there. There wasn't anything there. So at that point, I got really freaked out. And I left my bedroom, ran to the kitchen, called my mom at work, and I was really hysterical. And God bless her. Can you imagine being called at work, by your 9-year-old saying that there's like someone in the house? And She said, go and hide. I'm going to have someone come check on you. It turned out that there was a man who lived across the street from us who worked like third shift or something like that. And so she was going to call and wake him up and send him over to check on me. So in the meantime, I went and hid as far away as I could get, which was my parents' master bedroom or bathroom, the ensuite. And as I'm walking from the kitchen to go to the hallway to go and hide in one of the bedrooms, I'm actually hearing the door from the garage to the house downstairs opening and closing and somebody coming inside. And it was so close, like the staircase, I could, you have the sense that someone's right around the corner. And I had to actually run past the staircase in a moment's decision in order to be far enough past that whoever was coming up would not see me, that I wouldn't actually head into them. So I run down the hallway, go into my parents' bathroom. I shut the door and I hid in the bathtub, which had like a sliding glass door that was, like modeled where, everything's sort of blurry if you look through it. And I got in there and I laid down. I couldn't drag the door closed because, then you could hear it. So I laid down as flat as I possibly could in the tub in hopes that if someone came and looked into the bathroom, that they would just think it was empty. I did shut the bathroom door though. I closed it. I don't remember that like making a noise or anything. But as I'm laying there waiting for whoever neighbor person to come rescue me, I can hear someone moving around in the house. And I can see in the crack of the doorway right above the floor, there's that little gap. And you can see if someone's standing there because it creates a break in that line of light. And before I even saw that, because that's what I'm looking for, I'm like, oh my God, somebody's going to come to the door. And I'll be able to tell by looking at the crack under the door. I could actually hear the sound of feet on carpet. Like it was this really quiet sound, but it was like someone was standing on the other side of the door.
Oh my God, you're giving me chills.
So at this point, the front doorbell starts to ring, 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 ring. Like just somebody is pounding on the front doorbell. Whoever it was that was about to come in and get me must have fled. I ran to the door and let in the neighbor who had been woken up from a deep sleep and arrived with a claw hammer, like ready to, to rescue me with a claw hammer. And he was armed. So I let him in and he's checking the whole place out and there's no sign of anyone. Nothing has been moved. There's nothing in the garage. No doors are open. Everything's locked. It just was no one that was there. Later on, I was home alone for some other reason, maybe months later. And I was walking past my parents' master bedroom. And I heard a voice say, "Don't look in there." Like it whispered it. And of course I looked,
Duh.
I looked into the bedroom and I saw this old man in a wife beater tank top with a German shepherd sitting at the foot of the bed looking at me. They were both looking at me. He looked really ill, like he was sweaty and like, and it smelled like a dog, like a really overpowering smell of a dog. And I freaked out. I ran and left the house. Now, just to tie it all up, years later, when my brother turned 21, and the reason why I remember this is because he went to legally have a margarita with me. And we were on the way to a relative's for Thanksgiving or something like that. And I was 24 and he was 21, 25, 21, somewhere around there. And he brought it up we started talking about living in that house. And in my mind, I had been alone in all these experiences because I had this like little 5-year-old kid that I didn't think was really seeing or hearing any of the stuff that I did. But my brother remembers everything. And the amount of detail that he remembers about things, he'll bring it up and you're like, holy crap, how did I forget that? And so just out of the blue, we've never, ever talked about it in a million years. He says, remember that man in the bedroom? And I was like, okay, hold on. Before you say another word to me, I want you to describe what he looked like, what he was wearing. And he described the same thing that I saw. And he was not even there when I saw the man in the tank top with the German Shepherd. And he said to me something about the fact that he had had a heart attack there. Like my brother knew all this information about this person that I never even knew. But the crazy thing is that he hates to talk about stuff like this. So it's very, very rare that you can ever get him to speak about it. But yeah, the greenhouse, that's what we call it. It was like the haunted house. There are other stories, but that was some of the creepier ones.
Did anyone other than, later finding out your brother, did anyone else experience anything in the house?
Not that I know of.
It was just a year, right?
Yeah, we only lived there for a year, if I remember correctly. It was like one school grade for me. My parents don't typically experience things like that, yet they also are completely cool with if you tell them that you did. They're like, oh, okay.
So they would have been okay telling you if they had experienced something.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're both very aware of the fact that my brother and I refer to it as haunted and that we both had all these experiences, but they didn't really have any of those experiences. I think their experiences at that time were probably things just related to the stress of the transition of moving and, doing all that kind of stuff. I think that's what they were focused on. My mother was going back to work. There were a lot of other things I think going on with them in a classic kind of kids adventure story. The parents were sort of absent. You know what I mean? Like they weren't plugged in the same way we were.
Stay right there. Stir your tea. Because when we come back, Christine, a Paranerd listener, will be joining Slade.
You're listening to the Big Seance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Be sure to check out BigSeance.com for more discussion.
This episode of the Big Seance Podcast has been sponsored by Nuwati Herbals, a family-owned business operated in the St. Louis, Missouri area since 2002. The Cherokee people have a word for universal energy. That word is Nuwati. Rod Jackson is the founder of Nuwati and has personally developed their products from recipes influenced by his Cherokee ancestors. The Nuwati line consists of natural herbal products designed to actually do something. They promote healing, healthy skin, relaxation, and energy. They produce 4 lead product lines: herbal teas, herbal bath salts and scrubs, herbal bath bags, and herbal balms and body oils. They also have soaps, natural insect repellent, and a line of pet products. Nuwati has been featured at numerous red carpet events at the Grammy Awards, the Teen Choice Awards, the Oscars, the Emmys, and the Screen Actors Guild Annual Health Fair. Visit NuwatiHerbals.com and use code BIGSEANCE, all one word, to receive 15% off your Nuwati Herbals order as a thank you. Again, that's NuwatiHerbals.com, and Nuwati is Nuwati.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Seance Podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
So here's Christine, a listener who jumped at the opportunity to receive some intuitive counseling from Slade Roberson. It was really nice to talk to Christine. So thank you, Christine. Here we go.
I know something I'd love to ask Christine because, this is something that we totally did last minute. I told Patrick a couple hours ago, I said, hey, I want to be on your show again. He said, how about today? And I said, sure. So, we're just rolling with the synchronicity of everything. And I'm a big believer in timing. So I was wondering, what do you think is significant about the fact that you are here today in this moment talking to someone about developing your intuition?
Good question. Well, I always kind of think about it. I am a professional clinical counselor, and I know that a lot of times my intuition, well, probably that's more than even half of my job. And so I've got actually a question specific to that. And I am in an area that recently suffered two pretty major community tragedies. And as a counselor, I've had the experience of experiencing other people's trauma. So actually, this is kind of cool in a number of ways. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. There's usually something in the timing of why now, you know what I mean? So I'm interested to know like the context of where you are in this moment in time and why it would be meaningful for you to be talking about this now. So what kinds of questions do you have related to that? You said you had something related to being a counselor specifically.
Yeah. Pretty much every single session I have, I will have, I call them thoughts. They pop into my head and I am compelled to share them with who I am working. And so I have been told in the past that I am clairaudient. I don't know. I don't know the difference between a thought and someone telling me something. So yeah, that's kind of my question. How do I tell the difference? Does it matter if I tell the difference?
Okay, that's a great question. Actually, clairaudience and claircognizance are often overlapping or even disguised as one another. The very fact that you called it thoughts and you described something sort of popping in, the thing about claircognizance is people describe it as knowing something that they really have no prompt for knowing. It's like the information is just suddenly there. It's like an instantaneous download. It didn't have, like for instance, when somebody has a clairvoyant experience, they have a dream or they have a moment where, you know, I'm sitting in my chair and I look over and I see the thing. With claircognizance, it's one of the most challenging abilities to kind of dissect, because think about like the old I Dream of Jeannie, Bewitched special effects where, you know, you cut the tape and you go from someone being there to somebody just winking away or, you know, blinking into existence. And it's just one frame is empty, one frame has something in it. So we're very used to, especially with our current technology that allows us to play with audio and video, we understand we can rewind things and listen to the last 10 seconds. We can pause, we can zoom in, we can go back to the beginning and watch something again. We can slow it down. We can look frame by frame. So we have all these ways of conceptualizing clairvoyance, especially clairaudience to a certain degree. The thing about clairaudience is you usually experience it as it has a source. So for instance, there's a voice. Now the voice may be in your head. It may not sound like it's coming from another room. It may just be a voice within your own head, but you identify the thought with a voice. Like, oh my God, at that moment, I heard my grandmother say such and such, you know, or I remember, you know, my dad telling me something and that popped up right there in that moment. And it felt like I needed to share that. That's the kind of thing that I would say, okay, that's a little bit more clairaudient. But when it's just a pure thought that you really can't even tell when it appeared, it just was there in the moment. It's just instantly there. It's fully formed and you are conveying it. That to me speaks more of a claircognizant ability. So the cool thing about developing claircognizance is some of the tools that work with clairaudience are useful. The techniques and the modalities that you would use, like automatic writing, for instance, which is, you know, very language based, can be a really good tool for you to exercise as a claircognizant person. Are you familiar as a counselor with the concept of like proprioceptive writing or free associative writing, you know, where you just have someone basically journal whatever comes to mind? Okay, so that is a really, really great claircognizant technique or modality to employ if you want to develop that skill. One of the things that the reason why I think that works, even though you're typing and you're writing in language, is because when we're trained to speak a certain language at a really early age, it's very hard for us to think a thought without attaching a word to it. You know what I mean? It's like our brains, are already attaching language to it. The minute you try to convey that to another person, that information gets translated into words and language. So that's the reason why I say clairaudience and claircognizance can kind of overlap to a certain degree. And usually people who have a little bit of one of those skills have the other as well. I would say that as a counselor, you're a verbal person. You probably pay a lot of attention to not only what someone's saying, but the subtext of what they're not saying, and the helper language, the weird way that they back into revealing something, instead of being blunt or whatever. You're analyzing all these sort of neurolinguistic clues, and not only are you listening to the information someone's telling you, but you're also reading the way in which they communicate, right? And there's so many different levels of that. And because you, to a certain degree, if that's an ability you have, you've been doing it for so long that it's just part of the way you think that you think, and then on top of that, you add the impulse to have the training, the professional training to be a counselor, and suddenly you've got all kinds of skills and techniques and tools and processes around that ability to then kind of armor it up and give it lots of plugins and apps and stuff. So, I would say at this point, you probably, so much of what you experience that is intuitive is flying under your radar.
Okay.
Are there any follow-up questions to that, or?
Question and follow-up, maybe. You said something about things just knowing. Sometimes I know things, and not necessarily about somebody else, just about something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how do I know that? I read voraciously as a kid. I still read a lot. So I think, I must have just picked it up. So I don't know. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Just knowing things?
Yeah, sometimes knowing things that you can't know is a pretty clear, indication that it's coming from somewhere else. Maybe you just instinctively, someone's telling you a story about something and you're just thinking, no, that's not true. Something else happened. And you may not even know what it is, but you know that there's something more there than they're aware of. Now, there are other times when you have stored what we call a frame of reference, which means like you said, you've read voraciously about things. And so your subconscious mind is stuffed with information. Now, I do believe that there is a kind of quasi-intuitive phenomenon where our intuition will pull from our frame of reference as a way of cueing us with answers to a question. So for instance, maybe you have a client that is telling you about an experience that they had, and they're trying to, evoke the way that they felt about it. And maybe they're not very good at communicating it. Sometimes you will have a flash of, something from the past, or something that you haven't even really consciously thought about in a long time. And it's almost like there's a part of your mind that's pulling that out as a kind of flashcard to say, here's what that means. And you can access that memory, and it's something really dense, and it has, not only information, but it has emotion within it. And in that moment, it's all such an instantaneous thing. You think, okay, I get what this person is trying to tell me because I had this frame of reference come in. To describe that another way, it happens a lot with people who are medical intuitives. So for instance, one of the hardest things for somebody to deal with who's a medical intuitive that hasn't really trained themselves to be one is that sometimes they don't have the vocabulary to describe what it is that they're picking up or seeing. They're like, there's like this thing underneath your liver and it looks kind of weird. They don't know what they're talking about. So I will actually tell people who are experiencing medical intuition, which may come in initially as a vague feeling of like, this person's color looked sort of cloudy, or there was a place on their body when I stared at them that looked like it was murky or something. And one of the best ways that you could develop that is to then go and stuff your frame of reference with anatomy. In the training program that I do, Automatic Intuition, if I have someone come in with an aptitude or an interest in medical intuition, I assign them anatomy coloring books as a way of developing their frame of reference visually and also with the language or the vocabulary around that. So does that answer your question about the idea
I think so.
of memories?
Yeah.
So when you were talking about the impulse to share the information that you get when you're in a session with someone, what is the feedback that you get when you do share one of these pieces of information? How do people respond to it?
Typically very good. It's typically something in relation to the subject where we are discussing. And what I've learned to do is I just lead with, okay, I've got a thought and I've learned that I needed to share it. And then I share it. And then we just basically go from there. And they either agree, disagree, or it's meaningful for them and we go with it from there.
That's excellent. Okay, that's good that you have developed that. Because one of the things that people experience is an inhibition. Like, how do I tell this person in a clinical setting that I've just had, an angel whisper something to me or whatever it might be? And I like the authenticity of just saying, you know what, I'm having one of my thoughts. And I've learned that when I have these thoughts, I should share them. That sort of sets someone up. You're basically communicating to that person, I'm getting an intuitive hit for you, and I'm going to tell you what it is. So you are kind of prepping them that this is a different type of information that's coming through for you. So some of the things that you might want to do, because I have people ask the question all the time, what if I get a piece of information like that? How do I introduce that in conversation to someone? And I have a little trick that I like to do that doesn't freak anyone out, is just tell them you had a dream about them. Like, say, for instance, you have an intuitive feeling about a friend of yours or your mom or your sister or whoever it might be. And you're like, okay, I cannot tell this person that I just had a flash and I need to tell you because it was one of my magic thoughts, because for whatever reason, they're going to judge me. The thing that's really interesting about telling someone you had a dream about them is they always want to know what the dream was, Like, I don't think anybody's like, really great, and just walks away. They're always going to want to know, well, what was it? What happened? What was I doing in the dream? So that's a little bit of a white lie, but I think it's a good way of softly introducing to someone, here's a piece of information or an impression that I have about you that's not my normal logical analysis, but it's coming from somewhere else.
I actually had a really, at the time, it was oh my God, what do I do with this experience? A while ago, I strongly believe a patient's deceased daughter speak to me. And what she told me, she was telling her dad. But at the time, I did not feel at all comfortable sharing it just because of the context of what was going on. So I actually was able to consult professionally with a consultation group I belonged to. And so that was really cool. I shared it with him. He was very grateful. I don't believe I have ever had that straightforward of an experience. So I don't know if that has anything to do with what you're talking about. But at that point, I did not feel comfortable in the moment sharing with him because of the context.
Yeah, I totally get that. You would be surprised that the number of people that I work with who are counselors or social workers or people who work with people in a medical context, especially people who touch other people, like massage therapists, yoga instructors. You guys all come in with these experiences because the professions that you're in lend themselves very well to having these kind of experiences come up. So you guys are both more likely to have intuitive hits about people and have them be things that are useful within the work itself, within, explaining to them or dissecting what's going on with them or, communicating about their issues. And then on top of it, though, there is also a conflict, right? About how far can I go with, telling someone their daughter's communicating with me when we're sitting here in a therapy session, So that is something that comes up a lot and we talk about it. The interesting thing is, Christine, one of my life coach clients recently said, if I offer to do life coaching with someone, everyone is like trying not to make eye contact with me because it sounds like, oh my God, like a lot of work. I'm going to have to like examine myself and like think about stuff I don't want to or whatever. And she said, the minute I told the same people, hey, I'm doing intuitive readings, she was like, every hand shoots up into the air. And she said, but for her, she's doing a lot of the same thing no matter what, when she's working with people. There's such an overlap between counseling and, what I do, I even call intuitive counseling because there are so many coaching skills involved and there is a lot of clinical psychological, modalities and methodologies behind it. And I think it just speaks to the fact that you work in a field that is a relatively new profession historically. It's like Jung and Freud were not that long ago. They developed a field that became an official clinical academic area of study relatively quickly. It's like, name another field at a university that you can major in where two people kind of invented it in the span of one lifetime. You know what I mean? And before that, prior to that, and Jung is very open about his fascination with the archetypes and symbolic language and dreams and tarot. And, he loved all that stuff. And I think that the reason why people are attracted to that kind of information is that there's really just something ancient about the mystical and, about being able to access that kind of information that speaks to us on this really primal level. We all get the chills a little bit whenever that's brought in. It's like there's something within our DNA that recognizes it. And I think it's still there, even in the work that you do now. I think that it's still there.
Christine, I'm curious. You mentioned about some local tragedy in your area. And
Yes.
I don't know if you've been directly working with that, but I was, if you can share, I was curious to know if you've been getting intuition and how you're processing that kind of information coming up after this tragedy, or if you are.
Sure. Gosh, I don't know if this will answer, but even though it's kind of odd. I would say about 3/4 of my caseload have some degree of connection with what happened. And so what I've been doing for the past couple of weeks, when I see someone, is I ask them, how are you doing after the event? And it's pretty amazing. It's almost as though it gives them permission to talk about it. A lot of people are like, I don't get why I'm feeling like this. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know any of the victims. I don't know any of the survivors. But they're still affected. And that's very normal. I mean, clinically, I could talk about that for an hour. I guess my intuition led me to not, to confront this head on with everybody, regardless. I mean, I've had people directly affected in those that I wasn't sure. And so that question, when I meet with them, or if I haven't been meeting with them, I've been calling my people to check in on them. I felt that it was important to do that for folks, so that it gives them permission that if they are feeling something and they don't think they have the right to feel it, that they can talk about it.
People listening to this aren't seeing the video that we can see, but I can just tell you, oh my gosh, the energy that you're giving off right now and the wonderful smile that you have. People would be lucky, I think, to have you kind of jumping in to help.
Thank you.
So I love that we connected with you today.
Yay!
Do you have any more questions for Slade?
Well, what really tuned me into your request, Patrick, is I think you mentioned something about how to speak with your guides or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if Slade would be willing to touch on that. I don't know how much time we have, but.
Yeah, I have actually a small tutorial called Talking to Your Spirit Guides. My whole thing, when we were talking earlier about, intuitive thoughts versus logical thoughts, one of the things that I've noticed about the intuitive mind versus the thinking mind is that intuition is very fast. you mentioned earlier when you were having these impulses to share information, you were very quickly putting it out there. You weren't taking it home and analyzing it and, overthinking it and then coming back to these people. In the moment, you had the impulse to sort of, you know what, maybe I'm going to sound like an idiot, but I'm just going to say it anyway. And that's actually a really good state of mind to use when you're trying to access intuition, because sometimes it doesn't necessarily make sense with the story that you're wanting to put together. Sometimes the information that comes through that's incongruent in some way is actually valuable. I know for me personally, I experience some of the more psychic type of information. It makes me uncomfortable in a way that makes me feel inhibited to share it. So I have a client who is a stand-up comedian who's also a psychic. And the very first time we spoke together, she apologized for the fact that that sounded like two of the stupidest things in the world to put together. Stand-up comedy and and psychic ability. And I said, no, it actually makes perfect sense to me, because you have a very practiced ability to be unfiltered, to allow yourself to say something without thinking about it first or preparing it or rehearsing it, but just allow it to come through you, right? So there's this whole idea of allowing, that is at the core of everything. Something else that is at the core of intuition is speed. Intuition is very fast. You have a blink of an impulse or an impression. In the second, you get like a full picture about what's going on with someone, say, for instance. And then your thinking mind comes in after that and starts to unravel it, embellish it, maybe even argue with it or talk you out of it. If left alone in the vacuum of your own mind long enough, you can take apart any good piece of intuition and talk it to death and until it's just not useful anymore and become very insecure about it. So there's a couple of things that will help you in developing your ability. One of them is, like I said, to practice exercises that are related to modalities that you have already shown an aptitude for. For instance, what kind of clairs are you sort of lighting up? And in your case, we've talked a lot about clairaudience and claircognizance. You do talk therapy, which is like that just encompasses so much of those skill sets. So one of the best ways for you to communicate with your guides would be through automatic writing practice. Something else that you can do if you're not too inhibited, maybe I like to do it in my car because then there's nobody there to witness it, is to speak, to allow it can be the voice of your higher self, the still small voice within you, the voice of your guides, whoever it is, allowing it to come out of your own mouth. And one of the best ways to prompt this, whether you're doing a writing exercise or doing an exercise where you're just channeling, is to create questions as jump off points. So what do you want to ask your guides? Can you make that into a question? Once you can make it into a question, can you write the answer to what they say? And I had a client recently who really couldn't get past the whole, imagination versus intuition. And they're very close lanes on a highway. They're very close to one another, and you can slip back and forth in between the two. But there's nothing wrong with that. The imagination can be very useful in accessing your intuition. So, for instance, I had her do an exercise where I said, imagine you are writing a story about a version of yourself who's psychic. And that version of yourself that's super psychic is going to answer that question. What does she say? Write that piece of dialogue. And she was actually able, through feedback, because we were doing exercises with practice clients, she was actually able to coax herself into writing imaginary screenplays of conversations about what the guides said in response to a question someone had. And then we gave that information to the client, the practice client, and had them evaluate it the same way they would any kind of psychic reading. And the feedback was actually really strong and really encouraging. the stuff that came through in her imaginary psychic dialogue was actually really strong and accurate to the people who were on the receiving end of it. That speaks to one other piece of the puzzle. So the things I've mentioned so far are skills that you can use to kind of play on your own, right? To access your intuition. But if you really want to learn how your intuition works, you need to get outside your own head and get some feedback. So doing readings for other people, and you're in an interesting situation where you are reading people. They're coming in and bringing you stuff all the time, and you're having these intuitive hits and you're sharing them with them. You remember when I asked you the question about what their response was to
Yeah.
the information? That's
Yeah.
the feedback that I'm talking about. So
Okay.
you can gamify that and do it with friends, or do it with people in the, the Facebook group that Patrick has, or something like that. Find some online friends and practice those skills intentionally. Do it as a game, just as a process of self-discovery, and see what comes up. You might be surprised at what you're able to do.
What kind of questions does one ask their guide?
Well, that's a really good question. Recently in my Facebook community, the Shift Your Spirits community, we had someone who's a tarot expert who talked about the difference in the way that you present questions can have a really big impact on the type of information that comes through for you. And he had a whole list of better questions to ask your tarot reader kind of thing. But some of the things that we stay away from are yes or no questions. Sometimes that's just too simple, and you actually would get more meaty information by asking something open-ended. So if I was going to ask my guides a question, I try to make it an open-ended question. I try not to get into prediction too much, because I don't necessarily believe that everything is fated to happen a certain way, and that we all have the potential to take action in a way that changes, the future of what might happen. So, taking time out of it is always sort of helpful. One of the things I personally ask my guides a lot when I am overanalyzing or thinking about something that I'm worried about, usually the questions that we want to ask our guides are about decisions at the end of the day. It's always about door number 1 or door number 2. And I've thought about it to the point where I really don't know which one's better than the other. So one of the questions I really like to ask my guides a lot is, what am I not seeing about this circumstance? That's one of my favorite questions to ask. Another question that I like to ask is, instead of asking why something happened, like especially something tragic, like the things that happened in your community recently, instead of asking why that happened, ask what you can do with what happened. What kind of meaning can we make from what happened? That's a much more constructive question, and it will give you a lot more empowering answers. And you could take those right there and go do an automatic writing exercise with it. Take those questions and go set the timer on your phone for 15 minutes and write whatever comes to mind. That's a great way to communicate.
Cool. Thank you.
And just
Thank
like
you.
Slade said, we've had that kind of thing before in the Big Seance Parlor, where someone is just looking to practice, or wanting to find some practice clients,
Mhm.
And so I love that kind of thing, because to me, like, that whole community, we're kind of a giant class anyway on just learning about this whole paranormal spiritual thing and our abilities. So I welcome you to try that if you decided you wanted to. And lots of people will jump on that, and they'll be very open and forgiving and nerdy about it all. Christine, you
Awesome.
totally rock, and thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. This has been awesome.
Cool.
Thank you. It was great to meet you. Hope
Nice
to
meeting
be in
you,
touch
Slade.
with
Thank you.
again. Bye.
Thank you.
So, Slade, that was a really cool experience, and I'm really glad we did that. I feel like that could be helpful for a lot of people, and a good representation of, just some of the work that you can do and how you can help people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So tell us what's coming up for Slade Roberson and, just give us a send off, maybe some final thoughts on where we can find you and all that stuff.
Well, I am actually kind of beta testing a new version of my automatic intuition professional training, which is, I have a lot of people take the professional training who don't intend to be professional intuitives. And as I've taught the class for 10 years, it's based around 3 mentoring sessions. And the third session has always been a little bit more about the business of being psychic, putting yourself out there. What do you call it? What you put on your website, how much you charge, all that kind of stuff. But what I'd noticed is that we have a population of people within the automatic intuition community who come in just to do the work of discovering their practice and how their abilities work and to do the practice readings and be a part of the community. And they kind of stop there. And I realized too that even the certificate that I offer, the certification requirements can be met even with just those 2 sessions. So what I am doing currently, if you're listening to this in, early autumn 2019 or whatever, I have started to offer a 2-session version of the course, which makes it a little bit more cost effective for people. It's not as expensive. And it's also a little bit more intended to be less pressure for you to go out and become a professional psychic, and more just like if you want to explore these skills and abilities and still be welcome to do that and to plug in and to be a part of that. So that is something that we are experimenting with right now in my world. I feel like it will make it easier for more people to be a part of that. And it will make it easier for me too, in terms of my time, to serve more people with those sessions. So that's what's going on. If you're interested, you can go to automaticintuition.com. And if you would like to listen to me more, I have a show called Shift Your Spirits. And that's available at sladeroberson.com or on iTunes and everywhere that shows appear.
Thanks for inspiring us, Slade.
Thank you for hosting such a great community of people. I'm glad to be back.
Awesome. And I'm definitely going to want you to submit a good title for this episode. And so be thinking about that after we'll
brainstorm. We'll brainstorm. Let's see what we can come up with.
Thank you to the following super paranerds who support this show at patreon.com/BigSeance. Justin J. Justin, Bliss is my muse, David Rubenstein, Genesis, Natalie, Sonia B., Kim Robb, Jim Budd, Josiel Lorenzo, Susan Davey, Paula Mitchell, and Amy Park Gedicke. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Linda of shimmeringmoons.com, Denise Sia of Mystic Moms Paranormal, James Wilfong, Glenna Becker, Diane Rax, Nettie, Joni Kuntz, Sylvie, Jeffrey Peck, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Peggy Hagen, Sharon Bowles, Marion Hover Clairvoyant, Bruce Williams, Christopher Kohler, Lena and John of Carbon Lilies, Anna Frias, and Norman and Linda Keller. That sound you just heard was the Above and Beyond There's Not Even a Category for Your Level of Support fireworks display, because I have 2 awesome listeners who support the show at the $10 level, Steve Skinner and Jackie Pacheco. So thank you, Jackie and Steve. And thank you, Paranerds.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit BigSeance.com.
You can find and subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere podcasts are found.
Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to BigSeance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to BigSeance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.